Label Machine Podcast. We are back with another episode. This podcast is a train, it is a locomotive that is going and going, and it is not stopping. Today, I have on Dorothy Williams. Dorothy Williams is a historian, an educator, an author who specializes in Canada. What do you know it? Dorothy, how's it going?
Oh, it's going fine. Yeah, we're up here in the northern part of the continent in Canada, above the 49th parallel. That's us. Yeah,
Fantastic.
there's a black segment up here too.
Fantastic. So,
Yeah.
what is it about your upbringing that made you want to specialize in Canada?
I'm Canadian. And so my interest has been very much my local community, the history of Blacks within Quebec, which is the province that I belong to. And my family has been here for generations. So I really wanted to chronicle their experiences here in the province of Quebec. And it's really was unknown at the time that I was doing the initial research. It was about 30 years ago or so. And so it's taken a while for people to kind of wrap their head around the idea that, oh, we had Black people here 200 years ago. Oh, 300 years ago. Ooh, the beginning of the province. So that is starting to sort of change the way people are framing Black presence here in the province of Quebec. So my research is really about trying to change that. I guess the invisibility of the silence, eh? Because we're not, Black studies here in Quebec is only slowly being integrated into the school curriculum. It hadn't been before. It wasn't even thought of, really. It certainly was pushed back when students used to protest about, hey, we would like to learn about the Black Canadian experience. We want to know about our history here in this country. And they just weren't interested. I think now, sort of like, what's going on? What was the local history has really come to the fore, I think, due to BLM or George Floyd. Moment that has really hit has had global repercussions, and in our little part of the continent, it has also had repercussions here as well. So, and the consequence of that is more and more recognition that there is a Black history, and it has been what I would say here in Quebec, écrasé, and what I mean. Um, Understood at one time and then erased. So that's what my research is all about. That's what my company is. We create school products, pedagogical materials for teachers to teach African Canadian history right across this country. Includes some stories from Quebec, Nova Scotia, Ontario, and other parts of the country as well. So just about everything I do has the same theme. It all is really about trying to make visible the invisibleness of my skin color, basically.
Hmm. And so you specialize in the history of Black Canada. So I'd like to maybe start at the beginning of Black Canada. You're talking about 200, 300 years. These are things that we didn't know about this. We didn't know about this growing up. Can you tell me about, even particularly as it relates to Montreal, when
Hmm.
Blacks and Africans maybe first came to Montreal?
Actually, pretty well close to the 400th anniversary. 1629, 1628, somewhere around there. So we're at what, 23, 20, we're hitting about 23. So we're pretty close to the 400th year mark. And we can actually say in the written records there was a slave here in Montreal. So that's 400 years of history that I would say maybe 98% of people in this country have no clue about, because it's nothing that they're taught in school at all. So no recognition of the pockets of Black population that we have now have come from various migrations. Most of those have been from the United States, but not all. We have a significant Caribbean population that, and the immigration rules were relaxed. during the 1960s and early 70s, there was an influx, a large influx of Caribbean migrants and workers, as I'm sure you know from American immigration history as well. And they've really, I think, helped to flavor, if you will, what blackness in Canada is all about. Um, it's almost a West Indian culture that's been transplanted up here. So that also feeds into sort of the narrative of what it is to be Black in Canada. And it means different things in different places, just as it would in the United States. Different states have different flavors. So you grow up with different ideas, different idioms, different cultures, local holidays, and things like that. And that sort of like has an impression on your identity. Well, it's the same thing in Canada. And in Montreal, so slavery existed up until the end of, let's see, 1834, August 1st. That's our Emancipation Day here in Canada, by the way. August 1st, there are several places in Canada, if you want a holiday here in the country, come up for the August 1st Emancipation Day celebrations. And that's when we celebrate the end of slavery here in Canada, the official end. And not just here, celebrated in other places around the world, because it came about as a law passed by the British Parliament that took effect in Canada. So it's the black fact in Canada is pretty long. It's almost as long as the very beginnings of the European exploration. And as we know, Europeans, when they explored, they brought their slaves. Canada was no exception. It just looks like it was an outlier simply because never talked about it. It was never taught. It was still the same. And so that border was pretty porous, both for First Nations people who would travel across the border, and many took a very long time before they even recognized that there was a border, because this really their territory. This was their land. This artificial European boundary called the border didn't always affect them. So the movement of Blacks, slave and free, as well as First Nations, didn't necessarily respect borders in the way we think of it today. There, so that's probably why you have such, I would say, varied migration experiences within Canada.
Okay, so there's a long lineage of different Black African diasporic groups coming to Canada, but I'm specifically interested in the history of Black Canada as it relates to slavery, because that's something that we don't talk about at all. I think we think of Canada and Canadians as the nicest people. Canadians, they love maple syrup and they would never enslave anybody. And especially when I think of slavery, I just sort of think of the specific industries that are maybe tied to slavery, especially in the South and picking cotton. Sort of what can you tell me about the history of Canadian slavery and sort of maybe the industries that the slaves were maybe in?
Well, I mean, the Blacks participated in the development. The early Blacks that were here as slaves, just like in the United States, participated in building the country. Clearing the land, building, the edifices that were needed, participating in caring for the livestock. I mean, we didn't have a year-round plantation agriculture as you did in the United States. It simply didn't have, the climatic conditions for that. We had what would have been called domestic slavery, similar to what would have been in the upper New York and in the in the New England states type of enslavement. It was a very different configuration of slavery. We did have large plantation farms, particularly when they were producing potash or tobacco in Ontario, potash here in Quebec. So we know of large numbers in the scores, perhaps 60 plus slaves at a time. on farms, but they were more the exception. You find, particularly Africans, not First Nations, because in Quebec in particular, um, our history of slavery is that actually more First Nations people, Aboriginals, were slaves than Africans. And so, African, when they were enslaved in Canada, particularly in the area we call Quebec, they were considered luxury items. Were more expensive for the slave owners to get. And if they got through the first year with the seasoning, whatever that was put on them, they tended to live longer because they were not driven by sun up to sundown work that would have, broken their back and broken their morale on the farm in the agricultural sector. It's Montreal's early history in its urban, well, I can't call it really a city. The village was a hamlet, then it became a village, the town of Montreal on the island of Montreal. It grew from the labor of Blacks. So you see them working in all kinds of industries. In fact, our first presses had Black labor. They also worked in the hospitals, and they worked in the mines. I know of at least one person who actually managed one of our first breweries, beer brewing factories that we had here, and a whole bunch of other things. I think also the state participated in owning slaves as well, as I'm sure you had that in various parts of the United States. So state executioner were Black. In fact, at least two or three of them were. And we had Black civil servants here in Montreal who were responsible for um, cleaning and also turning on the lights. I think there were gas lights at that time. So they were actually paid by the states. They were paid labor by the municipal uh, city councils at that time. So yes, Blacks participated in many, many different areas, and they were in great demand. We have letters from European colonists who were coming here, said, look, we can't get enough people to work for us here in Canada. Can we import slaves? We want to bring in slaves. And then they're making a demand to the monarchies in Europe to bring slaves to Canada. But of course, they had their own needs, and it wasn't an automatic yes. So often, what happened where slaves here were acquired through deals brought in through Boston and Philadelphia and New York, going north into Canada. So there was a relationship between, well, certainly that class of slave owner, but right up eastern seaboard. It didn't stop at the border, however imagined it was between British North America and the Americas, uh, and America. So they would bring in slaves into the colonies and participate in continuing to build. We had two major waves. The second wave happened after the American Revolution. When you think about that or not everybody wanted to stay under the Republican version of civilization. They wanted to remain under the crown, and I think they were called royalists in the United States. Here they became loyalists. In other words, loyal to the king of England. And when they came into Canada's, both East and West, they brought their slaves from these were African American slaves. They brought them into the colonies because they needed them to help rebuild their states, and do the same kinds of basic domestic chores and maintenance that they had done in the United States. So actual tax deal, one of the early tax deals was to allow these royalists to come into Canada with their American slaves and not pay taxes on them for a whole year as long as they didn't sell them. And so these kinds of negotiations to support the slave class owners, it just perpetuated slavery up here and allowed for, these waves of African American slaves into the country. So they said they participated doing many things from sewing, from uh, clothes making to working in industrials, working in the retail sector. Because when you think about the merchant class, and to many of the slave owners were of the merchant class because they needed to have labor to man their stores, to man their retail fronts. They lived in the back of the store with their family upstairs if it was a two-story place. But the front of the store, the front of their building was their actual business, their commerce, and often had slaves there who were basically handling customers and taking care of the goods and services and generating funds for the family, generating wealth. That's not that much different than the domestic class that you observe in terms of their participation and their generating wealth for the individual merchant that that existed in New York or in the northern United States.
Right. And I think both in America and Canada, they shared the sort of people that were loyal to the British crown. They both shared the same name of loyalist. Did you say royalist for America?
Yeah, they were called royalists in the United
Royalist.
States. And in Canada, once they arrive, they're called loyalists. And in fact, loyalism and the loyalists, we have loyalist associations in the country where people can actually trace their ancestry today to loyalists who came up from the United States into Canada, determined to stay under the crown and to support the crown versus joining this republic, the new republic that was being created.
Interesting, because growing up in America, we always hear that the two sides of the Americans in the Revolutionary War were you had the patriots and you had the loyalists on the American side. So I've never heard of the term royalist, but that's quite interesting.
Well, again, I mean, I often find terms, in my research, I often find terms change depending on the writing. So sort of research I've done right into my doctorate has been a question of looking I can almost tell, is this an American author that's writing about this event or is it a Canadian author?
Right,
Because
right,
the terminology will sometimes give you that clue right away.
right, right. All right, so I have another question. So you're telling me so much that gives me the idea that Canada wasn't so different to America in so many different ways. Something I wonder about is growing up when we learned about the history of slavery, we learned that in the South, every once in a while, us if the slave master, if the slave owner was a nice guy, maybe towards the end of the slave owner's life, they would give freedom to some of their slaves that maybe they liked the most. Do you know anything about the history of Canada in that regard? Was there a history of giving freedom to the slaves?
Oh yeah, there was. There was. You see that in the records. We had a notarial system here in Canada, and those are lawyers who work directly with the documents and they certified documents, right? And so these notaries would take great pains to ensure that every sale of a slave was recorded on in a slave sales document and any time that a master would free a slave, that there would actually be a document to say that manumitted them, they freed them, and therefore they were at liberty to continue to walk the streets and to gain gainful employment on their own. This was something that they actually have the documents and it's been recorded. We have historian Marcel Trudel and others who actually um, recorded that and looked at manumission. So it's actually a practice that did happen here. I think it shocks people though, because they also allowed for marriage of slaves to their children at times. Um, and, you know, you have stories of, you actually have a couple of stories of slaves requesting to become enslaved again so that they could um, marry and stay with this person that they fell in love with. And they wouldn't have been able to do that if they were free. So they had to re-enslave themselves. So you had that in the reverse as well. There's some interesting stories where you see people's lives being upended by this institution. Yeah, so it certainly happened on both sides of the border. And um, bedroom, say bedroom confessions, but really at the time of death, you actually hear sometimes where there this particular commandment or desire becomes expressed. And so other people hear it, and then it becomes sort of a legal thing, even though it's not written down. People then see that as having had legal weight, where the master has said, yes, I give you your freedom. There's a witness in the room and someone has acknowledged that, yes, in fact, this person is now free. Or I give you this freedom after 7 years, or I give you to my child if they ever choose to let you, to free you in 10 years, or whatever the conditions are, then they then get chronicled, documented, and because of the notarial system, we have records of that as well.
Amazing. So that's incredibly interesting to hear about people, slaves getting married to their former slave owners. I think maybe I want you to maybe
Not
talk a
former
little.
slave, not necessarily former slave. They would have just asked to be enslaved by the owner of that. In most cases, it would be they wanted to marry a female, it was a male who wanted to marry a female, and he would be told by the owner of the woman that he could only stay in the home if he was a slave. Therefore, he made the choice to become enslaved in order to be with this woman.
Okay, and so I just want to clarify some things because to me this is a bombshell. So you're I just want to make sure that I got it correct. So you're saying that you have a slave owner. For purposes of this conversation, the slave owner is a man that's 60 years old. And you're saying that the man would have this white man would have a daughter, and say this daughter is 19 or something, and you're saying that a slave would maybe become enslaved in order to marry this daughter.
No, I'm saying that slave owner would have a slave who was female
Mhm.
that he
Got it.
wanted to marry or to be with, and that could only happen if he was in the household of that master. In other words, he would have to allow himself to be enslaved by that master. So even though he was a free person who fell in love with an enslaved woman,
Okay.
he would then agree to allow himself to be enslaved for love. So
Got it.
whether he was born free and chose to be enslaved or had been freed because he had been enslaved before, he's now making the choice to become enslaved. But this is incredibly an exceptional case. I'm just throwing it out to just
Right.
c- because the human condition is so varied, it's so complex, and under certain kinds of stresses, people will react in different ways. And you think, could I accept this kind of oppression? Love makes people do all kinds of things. And here's an example. I mean, we see it in the Bible as well, where people, people re-enslave themselves in the Bible. Again, for the love of a woman, you have the same thing that happened during this 400 years of slavery.
So was there the same sort of animus, the same sort of racial animus in Montreal during slavery and towards the end of slavery that you could maybe compare to the conditions in the South, maybe
Mm.
during slavery and Jim Crow when blacks and whites couldn't hang out or even be seen together?
Different age and period. First of all, slavery in, as I said, in Canada's ended in 1834 for all intents and purposes. In many places in this country, it had already died before then. It was for some just a formality, the passing of the law. It was no longer in favor. It's a custom. I'm not saying there weren't slaves, but it was no longer something that people practiced eagerly. And so by 1834, and perhaps up until 1840, for those that moved directly into indentured conditions, at 40, 41, slavery is gone. You know, by 1865, 1867, around there, the end of the Civil War, it's a very different North America. You see, you're talking, 20, 30 years later, the continent has shifted into all kinds of new economy, and different relations are going on. It's not the same. End of slavery in the United States is not the same as the end of slavery in Canada in terms of where the world was at.
Mm,
Um, Even 30 years, okay, let's look at we're in 2022. Think back 30 years ago.
right.
I mean, you just barely had, I think most people had laptop computers, but that's what they were, laptops, right? So they were like these computers on your desk. Cell phones, what's that? I mean, it really was a different world. 30 years can make a very big difference in terms of technology, in terms of ideas and attitudes and reaction to technology infiltrating your lives and patterns and behaviors. So you look back with our lens today in 2022 and say, oh, well, the end of slavery, and compare that to the end of slavery in the United States. I'll say it's false equivalence, but let's be real. Let's be real. There are a lot of things that wouldn't have been the same. And to answer more directly in terms of attitude, I think really, I will say it really depended. Just like in the United States, you had some states that developed that never had slavery, or that had slavery in a very limited time for a very short period of time. So when Jim Crow came, it came for very different reasons. It wasn't a history of 400 years or 250 years of enslavement on that particular soil, right? Had the same thing in Canada. Not every province had actually slavery. Some of them came together as provinces after the end of slavery. 40, 50 years after the end of slavery, they became a province of Canada. So, and you have the same thing in the United States. So it was uneven. Um, and The racial animus, I think what can happen is sometimes you get movements, most times you get movements happening in the United States that spill over into Canada. So in those areas where you have pockets of blacks, clusters, what I call clusters of blacks, the spillover comes very immediate for them and very like in their face. As Jim Crow was building in the United States and separating, I mean, after the end, to push back for the Reconstruction, and the idea that blacks could even be equal to whites was like, are you kidding me? Um, and so the Jim Crow pushed back to ensure that the United States sustained its racial bifurcated society where blacks were here and whites were there, even though you didn't call it slavery anymore. So you put Jim Crow in place. And so you basically sustained what had been the world of your grandparents and your parents. And it persists for another 70 years or so.
Yeah.
Um, and that kind of spilled an attitude. We call it in Canada, or at least I do in my books, I call it Negro Phobia. It was a term that it was a term that I think reflected the Canadian mood. Even though we did not have slavery at the time of the Civil War, even though we were not having our own Reconstruction period, the effects of all of that and just concomitant rise of blackface, um, and sort of the denigration of blacks in popular culture and everything that goes with that whole period, right? Um, throwing out too many terms, I'm sure. But when you think of that period of time, uh, it's much closer to the end of American slavery than the end of Canadian slavery, which is what you asked me.
Right. So, and that's a really good point in terms of the differences in time periods. Something that does make me think of, though, is the fact that, okay, it was 1834, and that is at a time when sort of attitudes about equality, these are things that aren't even being talked about in barely in America. And so something that I wonder is about the fact that in a lot of cases, I think of the fact that in a lot of cases, you have, for example, actors that maybe grew up in the North. You think of, for example, an actor like Betty White. I know Betty White, during her long career as an actress, there was one specific instance when she was on some show and she wanted to bring a Black actor onto the show with her. And she had pushback from people in the South, fans of the show in the South, because of that sort of animus that remained in the South. And so my question to you is, in Canada, it being 1834 and slavery being abolished, did the end of slavery in Canada affect Canada's relationship with America? Did it sort of strain things because they weren't going with the American tide at all?
Mm. I mean, you're asking, it's a very, very complex question. You do realize that the Bank of the Confederacy was here in Montreal. Gather you didn't know that.
No, I didn't know that at all.
All right. Yeah. The Confederacy actually met, here in Montreal, and I believe they put over $1 billion in Canadian bank. There's a book that's been written about how the Confederacy actually stashed their money to take over, so that they assumed when they win, they would beat the North, they would have money, basically bankroll the Confederate government. And they did it in partnership with Canadians. Not all Canadians supported the North. We did have a certain class that were actually for what the South was all about, and the idea of, uh, I wouldn't necessarily say for racial reasons, although that played into it. I would think a lot of that had to do with they could grease my pockets, line my pockets, and I could benefit from the South more than I could benefit from the North. And also, Montreal was well known as a summer retreat for some of the slave owners, particularly those in the South. They would actually come up to Montreal and spend their summer vacation up here. So they developed friendships here in the Montreal elite class here in this city. So, you know, history is not clean, dry. It's pretty complex. It's not all one or the other. I mean, I guess I could stereotype and say, oh well, Canadians this and Americans that. But when you dive down into the real details and begin to understand it, there were certain segments that had different motivations than the prevailing stereotype, and may have acted contrary to almost totally contrary to what you would put on paper. So, and people get shocked about that, like they realize that, hey, we've got statues to Confederates up here, and we've got plaques that are honoring the South. How is that? We're Canadian, aren't we? Loving the whole idea of black freedom. I mean, blacks came up here as fugitive slaves, right? Canada. And followed the North Star. We gave them freedom when they came here from American enslavement. So somehow or another, it doesn't fit. They just can't wrap their head around those two things. The Canadians have trouble doing that. I'm assuming Americans are going to have trouble doing that as well. when I'm talking about the Confederates having their bank up here in Canada, this is also the place where John Brown planned his insurrection. The revolution was actually planned here in Canada, and the people that he recruited were from Canada. Uh, some of them were Americans that crossed the border and came back down. Others were actual Canadians that came down with him. So, I'm not sure if that's even part of the American narrative, uh, but it happened here in Canada, and then it went to the United States. you know, so the relationship between the two countries have been for generations and decades, have been quite closely entwined, and the spillover hasn't always gone just from the north to south. Sometimes it's gone from north to the south and south to the north. So,
It's
and as I teach, even during slavery, we had the same thing, because there were a time during slave period here in Canada where slaves actually from Canada went to the United States. If they crossed the border, they were free in the United States. And they were actually trying to leave Montreal to go to the United States to gain their freedom. And then you have the flip that happens about 2 to 3 decades later, where you have African Americans coming into Canada to get their freedom. Again, that other part of the story is rarely told.
wow.
So it's interesting. This I see these flips, these sort of counterintuitive moments in history that, for depending on which side you are on the border, are told or not. they're shared or they're not, or they're understood and understood within the complexity of the human drama of North America. It's not as cut and dry as people make out to be.
Yeah, history is definitely incredibly complex, and you've definitely made a good argument for that. It seems like, based on what you said, there are so many economic factors at play, especially in Canada, when it came to specific individuals' motivations for maybe helping out the Confederacy and things like that.
Well, I would think so if you could get a cut of $1 billion.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think there would definitely be motivation. And I also, I think that the relationships that had been developing over decades of, wintering or, summering here because they were coming to avoid I think the heat was really bad in the deep south during the summer. And so they came here. We consider it hot. Apparently it was cooler than what they were experiencing. So their summer homes were in Montreal. And see, you just you create a whole community, right? The summer community is very different than those that winter over and stay here year round. So yeah, that's going to breed a certain type of familiarity and camaraderie and fraternity within a supposed um, opposing groups politically. So it's well, we struggle with that even today, right? With MAGA versus non-MAGA. How do you sometimes you have to say no to a friend, and other times you sustain a relationship, even though you're not of the same thinking and the same values that carry you forward. People do that. Make choices. That's what history shows you if you look beyond the stereotypes and sort of the generalities that are written.
Yeah, that's
That's what
amazing.
my books are about. That's what I try to teach when
Yeah,
I'm sharing with my students. I think it's really important for them to understand that.
right.
So, thank you.
Here's another question I have, sort of departing from the talk about the Confederacy and the deep web into that. I sort of wonder specifically about the life that a Black person in Montreal might have, sort of in that late 19th century period, maybe early 20th century. What type of jobs would be available to them? Could someone in Montreal, a Black person, become a CEO? Was that a possible thing at the time?
You're funny, eh?
But I just like,
No, I well, Montreal, you're talking Montreal in particular. I mean, Montreal was the forefront of the major technological revolution at that time, which was the emergence of the railroad, right? And so that whole class of labor developed and became headquartered in Canada in Montreal. And so over time, because it wasn't exclusive in the beginning, blacks worked in many different roles on the railroad here in Montreal. And that was part of the attraction. So most of those people who worked on the railways were actually Americans who came into Montreal. And by about 1907 or so, there was a pushback from the white railroad workers that they had been working with, who decided did not want them to be working in any other job than being a porter. And so slowly they lost privilege, the entitlement to be able to work in any sector that they wanted to, and became relegated to being a porter. And so over time, the black man in particular became synonymous in Montreal with black porter, being a black porter, and that became almost the exclusive jobs. I mean, we had blacks who opened their own businesses. They were entrepreneurs, local businessmen. But generally speaking, we speak you talk about the kinds of job that would have attracted black men uh, who wanted to earn a wage of some sort. It would have been the railway industry, as particularly a Pullman porter.
hmm,
We also had red caps, but most of the lore and the energies goes over. Uh, I think focuses on the sleeping car porter, the
what does a
Pullman
red
porter.
cap do?
The red caps were the porters that met you at the train, um, the door, and they took your luggage and walked you to your train. And then the Pullman porter who was on the train would take your luggage and bring you to your chair, your seat, and to your berth or your room or wherever you were. So there were two types of porters.
Gotcha.
Red caps worked in the station.
Mhm.
They were the ones that tipped their hat that you would meet, that would take your luggage after you got out of your taxi or car or your horse or whatever. And the sleeping car Pullman porter
Hmm.
would be the ones on the train, would leave with the train.
Got it. And so you sort of speak about this division between the white train workers that sort of wanted to take back control over the industry and relegated the black train workers to that porter status. That sort of begs the question for me, at that around that time, what was sort of the division like in terms of living conditions, in terms of, in America we hear things like segregation and stuff. What sort of neighborhoods and areas, what did they look like in Montreal in terms of like divisions and segregation and things like that?
Well, very similar to what was going on. I mean, obviously you had your rural workers, but when blacks came together, particularly with the train right across North America created black communities in the sense that the black men in the neighborhoods would live around the train station, and sort of a black community often grew um, around the energies or the life cycle of the train itself. And so you had the same thing in Montreal and Toronto, Winnipeg, here, other places where the train um, relied on Black labor. So, particularly as I tell people in the area called Little Burgundy today, St. Antoine and Little Burgundy, they weren't the same community, but they were close. They were close to each other. And the reason blacks lived there is because that's where the trains were, and they had to be in walking distance. They weren't making enough money to have, to pay to go on the tram. They walked to work, and so they had to be within walking distance to get to work. And so around the train station, you start to see barbershops, you start to see back businesses, you start to see back rooming houses, so that when the men got off the train, they could sleep over, get a room, sleep over, clean their clothes, get their hair cut, get their shoes shine, meet up with people, talk to people in the community, and then be ready for the shift to start again the next day or 2 days later, depending. And so this would go on and on. This was a cycle, and so it was around the earliest modern development of, say, urban Black culture is usually around the train stations because they were so integral. I mean, at one point, the Pullman Porter by George Pullman, who was the owner of the Pullman Porter uh, company, was actually the largest employer of Black men in the United States and, in fact, in Canada. So that just they just became synonymous, the two, you know, Pullman Porter, George's men, different terms that were used to describe that sort of affinity and that connection between how Black men were paid, how their what the working conditions were, their training, their skills, and basically their lack of advancement. I mean, you know, once they were a porter, in most cases, the white workers, their co-workers, put in place very strong, very strict rules and regulations to stop their advancement so that these Black men would be literally just stifled and just only could be porters. They could not become conductors. They could not could not advance within seniority or could only advance to a certain level. And in the United States, you have the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, these Black men began to unionize and to organize themselves to counter that. And again, I'm generalizing because, of course, it's a little bit more complex than that. The whole idea that you could take a whole class of Black men and regardless of where they lived or you know where they worked, that they could be basically limited by the Jim Crow rules that were on the railways. And in Canada, we had the Order of Sleeping Car Porters. We had other sort of not legal unions, but these associations, men associations that came together to act on behalf of the Black labor class here in this country. Um, and eventually they got status and certainly was recognized by the railway companies to speak on behalf of the men. But it took decades. You know, you're asking me about the turn of the century. This kind of change didn't happen here in Canada till after it happened in the United States with the Brotherhood in the 40s. It happened here only in the 50s. So, you know, but by then it was basically the railway industry was dying. Um, as a passenger industry, the private individual automobile was taking over, and the emergence of the suburbs as the individual driver could then you know, move around as they choose in their car. And the heyday of the railways in North America began to diminish, and so the need for the Pullman Porter also diminished as well. So it was a lot easier for the company at that point, knowing that the nadir was coming, to again sit down and start to seriously negotiate and allow um, for Black advancement. Almost at the same time that young men, post-war, were like, I don't want to be a porter. I didn't go to war, you know, to come back and do what my father did. He didn't even get vacation, paid vacation. He couldn't even get a sick day. He had to work 24 hours sometimes for days at a time on a train. And that's not the life I want. And so two things sort of coincided by the time the 1950s came about. Rail travel and the allure of the Black railway porter was dying.
Hmm. Okay, so a sort of last question I'll ask you is you're you've said a lot about sort of this area of Little Burgundy and sort of this sort of hub for Black barbershops and sort of just Black commerce in general. And you also talked about the fact that trains were a dying industry, and we, you know, it's 2022 now, we don't see any trains anymore. uh, what does that Little Burgundy neighborhood look like these days? Is it still a Black neighborhood? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, What I said was that it was where Blacks congregated when they got off the trains, and they built community usually around the railways, which made sense. However, I didn't say that it was a Black community. Little Burgundy has never been a Black community, and Blacks have been a minority there. They're associated with the community because of their relationship both to the railways, which were right nearby, and also to the development of the jazz community in Montreal. And that those two things, I think, are part of what I think attracts the historian today to the story, the mythology that's developing about Little Burgundy is because of those two things together. And Little Burgundy, uh, even today, Blacks are a minority. They always were. I mean, I grew up there. There was a very strong Black community. The majority of Blacks in Montreal lived there, but the majority of Blacks were a minority. There was, in that time, maybe at most, maybe 5,000 Black people. That really shows you how strong the immigration laws were, the anti-Black immigration laws in the country, and it took decades, like 7, 8 decades to change. Um, so at that time, the small cluster of Blacks in Little Burgundy, they were just one of several different ethnic groups living there at that time, the Chinese and the Finns and the Irish, and the majority, I think, were French, French-speaking Quebecois. You had a large Italian community as well. Um, and so we all lived together. It was a very vibrant ethnic community. It continues to be today. It's just different ethnic groups. So you have Algerians and you have Iranians and still have some Black families there. But it's the community. It always was a multicultural, multi-ethnic environment simply because of being in the Southwest. Um, it's caters to the lower income population, and blacks struggle with economic and social mobility. So they tended to congregate in that neighborhood, along with usually immigrant groups that stay for maybe one generation or two, and then they move on. Um, and they develop communities elsewhere on the island, such as the feature of Little Burgundy.
Got it. Well, what we've learned today is that history is astoundingly complex, but
Yes.
thank you so much, Dorothy, for teaching me a little bit more about the depth of Canadian history, because I think me and my audience, we definitely need to know about it.
Thank you.
So thank you so much.